This video is going to focus on what's called Mendelian genetics, named after Gregor Mendel, who we call the father of genetics. I tend to call this simple genetics because this will kind of explain the basics behind the laws of genetics. There are three basic laws of genetics. One is called the law of dominant and recessive, which we'll talk about, the law of segregation, and the law of independent assortment. But when we're looking at genetics, genetics is the study of heredity. And heredity is the passing of traits from parent to offspring. Now, Gregor Mendel talked about heredity without even knowing what a gene was. You know, the structure of DNA wasn't really known until the 1950s. And we know that DNA is a cookbook, and cookbooks contain genes. And those genes tell you how to make proteins, just like cookbooks have recipes, and recipes tell you how to make something. Well, a gene is a recipe for a protein. And just like every recipe has two parts to it, you know, when you look at a recipe, it's got the part that gives you the ingredients, and then it has the part that gives you the instructions. And how to make the recipe, you have to have both parts. Like, I cannot just give you a bunch of ingredients and expect you to make the blueberry pie. At the same time, I cannot give you the instructions because it just says mix the flour and sugar and butter together. You don't know how much. You have to have both parts of that recipe. And this is why we have to have fertilization, because your mom's egg had half the recipe and your dad's sperm had the other half the recipe, and they had to come together to make your recipes. And so when we look at heredity, this is how these recipes, how these genes get passed from one generation to the next. And again, Gregor Mendel is considered the father of modern genetics. He studied pea plants and a whole bunch of other different types of plants and came up with this very rudimentary idea of inheritance. And again, it was amazing because he didn't know what DNA was at that time. We know that DNA is made up of sugars, phosphates, and nitrogen bases. And the nitrogen bases, if you think of DNA as a cookbook, every book has covers. And those covers are just there to protect the important stuff that's on the inside. It's the nitrogen bases, those letters, A's, G's, T's, and C's, just like letters come together on a page to form a word, those nitrogen bases come together to form your recipe. So when we look at genes, we're looking at these long lines of letters, and it tells us how to put the protein together. Well, some of your recipes are a lot like your mom. Some of your recipes are a lot like your dad. So that's why you have kind of a combination of the two. You look a little bit like your mom, you look a little bit like your dad, because some of your recipes are the same. Now, like I mentioned, Gregor Mendel used pea plants, and he actually got really lucky. With pea plants are really easy to grow. A pea is a seed, so the pea pod is actually a fruit. Okay? By definition, if you have a seed, you're a fruit. And by planting the peas, they grow really fast, and they're actually really easy to grow. You can grow them very easily at your house. They also make a lot of offspring. Each pea is a seed. So you can have a whole bunch of different seeds that you can study. And we can manipulate pollination. Pollination is how pollen goes from one flower to the next. Well, pollen to plants would be like the sperm to an animal. Not exactly the same, but I'm just going to use that analogy. And inside the flower has the ovary where the eggs are being held. So in genetics, peas have the ability to self-fertilize. Now, a lot of flowers cannot self-fertilize. Now, first of all, don't get fertilize and pollinate mixed up, even though I know it says this on the slide. Pollination is just pollen moving from one place to the next. Fertilization is egg and sperm coming together. Well, a lot of creatures cannot self-fertilize because the sperm has a chemical coating on it, and the egg has a chemical coating on it. Well, if those chemical coatings match, like things repel. So a lot of creatures cannot self-fertilize because the chemicals, the egg and sperm, kind of repel each other a little bit. But in the case of peas, they can. They can also cross-fertilize, which is, you know, pollen from plant A fertilizing the flower from plant B. And he also got real lucky because peas only have two contrasting forms. If you think about humans, look at all the different hair colors we have. Look at all the different eye colors, all the different skin colors. It's really hard to study humans because we have a lot of varying traits. Well, with pea plants, they got really, really, really easy. For example, if you're a pea plant, you either have purple flowers or you have white flowers. There's no different shades of purple. There's no combinations. There's no plant that has purple and white flowers, purple or white. Also, for example, of the seed color, you can have yellow peas. You can have green peas. Yes, peas are yellow. Now, we tend not to eat yellow foods because we think of yellow as being something that's rotten or decaying, which is why for a long time people wouldn't eat bananas or yellow peppers. Okay, but with peas, you can be yellow or you can be green. With pea shape, you either round or you're wrinkled. So this is what we're talking about, they only have two contrasting forms. It's like black or white. There's no shades of gray. Now, in the case of Mendel's three-step experiments, he wanted to study, why were the pea plants just purple, or why were the pea plants just white flowers? So he basically created two different control groups. Think of having two different fields, and they're miles apart. So one field, you just plant the seeds, and all these peas will have purple flowers. And in the field several miles away, you plant seeds, and all those seeds will raise plants that have white flowers. And since they're several miles away, there's no way that the pollen can cross-fertilize. So he just let those two fields grow over time. And so the field, let's just say in the east, would always grow pea plants with purple flowers, and the field in the west would always grow pea plants with white flowers. Well, he called these his pea generation. You can think of pea as parent or pea as pure, because in the east field, the flowers were always purple, and in the west field, the flowers were always white. Well, it makes sense if you have purple flowers, purple parents, you're going to have purple children. If you have white parents, you're going to have white children. So what he decided to do then is cross-fertilize. In the case of the pea plants, they were true breeding because they were allowing self-fertilization, or even if they had cross-pollination and cross-fertilization, all the flowers are purple or all the flowers are white. Well, he then decided to produce what he called his F1 generation. And F1 stands for filial, which is Latin for child. And so think of it this way. It would be like you have the east field that's full of purple flowers and the west field that's full of white flowers. Well, it would be like you going and cutting all the purple flowers and then taking them to the field with all white flowers and just shaking them. So all the pollen from the purple flowers come out and land on top of the white flowers. Well, this produced what he would call his F1 generation. And so he figures, since there was a combination of purple parents and white parents, that there would be a combination of children. So he crossed two different parent plants together. He crossed purple flower plants with white flower plants. However, all of the F1 offspring looked alike. So what that means was, again, if you had some purple parents and some white parents, most of us would expect that some of the kids would be purple and some of the kids would be white. Well, what he found every time he did the experiment, the F1 generation always was purple. Always, always, always. Which got him thinking, okay, well, where did the white go? Some of my parents are white. Some of my parents have white flowers. Where did that white flower trait go? So after trying this experiment for several times and always getting the same answer, he said, okay, I've got the parent generation. I have the F1 generation. What happens if I make an F2 generation? So if you think of the P generation as being the original parents, and then the F1 generation, he took two different F1s and crossed them together. So purple and purple. Well, again, if you have one parent that's purple and another parent that's purple, you would expect all the kids to be purple. However, every time he did it, it came out to be about a 3-to-1 ratio. For every 3 purple flower plants, he got 1 white flower plant, which led him to start thinking, okay, where did the white disappear to in the F1 generation? And why did the white come back in the F2 generation? Well, this, without knowing what different things were, even though this says Mendel's conclusions, we took what he came up with and have evolved it into modern day technology. We know that parents transmit information about their traits using their gametes or their sex cells. Gametes for males are sperm, gametes for females are eggs. And again, we now know that half of the recipe is found in the egg, and the other half of the recipe is found in the sperm. And you have to have both parts of those recipes to come together in order for you to be able to bake that cake. Well, each individual has two halves for each trait. Just like a recipe has two parts to it, the top half is usually the list of ingredients, and the bottom half is list of instructions. You can think of a gene as having two halves to it. Well, keep in mind, again, what a gene is. A gene is a segment of DNA that codes for a trait. It is a recipe that tells us how to make proteins. So when you say you have the gene for blue eyes, that means you have certain recipes that tells you to make certain amounts of proteins, and that's what gives you your blue eyes. If you say you have the gene for brown hair, that means you have certain recipes that make certain proteins, and those proteins are what give you your hair color. And again, your genes come from your parents. Well, we have to have fertilization because half of the recipe is in the egg and half of the recipe is in the sperm, and they have to come together. Well, he did not know about genes, but he now has these, he would use the term units or traits. Okay. Well, just a second ago, we talked about a gene and how a gene has a half. Well, you're going to see here in a second, I'm just going to go ahead and say it, that half a gene is called an allele, A-L-L-E-L-E. An allele is half a gene, or you can think of it that way. It's half a trait. So your mom has an allele for a certain like hair color, and your dad has an allele for hair color. And those two alleles have to come together to give you the entire recipe that you need in order to make hair color. Well, we know that now through what we now call the law of dominance and recessive, one allele is stronger than the other. And we tend to use capital letters to represent dominant and small letters to represent recessive, which is the one that's the weaker of the two. So if you get two units that are the same, meaning you've got two dominant alleles for one recipe, or you got two recessive alleles for the same recipe, you're what we call homozygous. Remember, the root word homo means the same. So for example, purple and purple. If you inherit two different alleles, like half of your gene is purple and half your gene is white, you're what's called heterozygous, because remember, hetero means different. And like I mentioned, different forms of a genes are these things that we call alleles. Nature doesn't want everything to be the same. So there are lots of different alleles out there. Think about how many different hair colors we have, how many different skin colors we have. There's lots of different combinations out there. And that's to allow for genetic variation. Okay? So when we look at an individual's alleles, their genes, this is what we call the genotype. If you look at the name, it's the type of gene a person has. If you look at what that person looks like, that's the phenotype. It's your physical appearance. Now, not all alleles get expressed. When you see the term expressed, when we talk about genetics or DNA, that's going to be the one that shows up. Okay? The one that's expressed is the one that shows up. That is going to be the dominant allele. Okay? The dominant allele is the one that's always going to show up. It's the stronger of the one, and it tends to be used with a capital letter. Now, when you're doing genetic problems, the letters you choose really don't matter. I just tend to choose letters that I can tell the difference between. Now this slide, since we're talking about purple flowers, uses P. So a big P would represent dominant. The recessive allele is the one that tends to hide, and that's represented by a lowercase letter. Now, if I were doing a genetics problem, I would not use P because it's very hard to tell the difference between a big P and a little p. So when you're doing genetics problems, the letter you choose does not matter as long as you can tell the difference between big and little. So I tend to use A's, B's, D's, E's. I never use O's, never use X's, never use Y's, because they're really hard to tell the difference between a big and a little. Well, this is what we now call Mendel's law of dominant and recessive. So for every genetic allele, one of them will be dominant, that's the stronger one, and one of them is going to be recessive. So when we're looking at a genotype, you could be, for example, big T, which means you're homozygous dominant, big T, which means you're heterozygous, or little t, which means you are homozygous recessive. Now, when you see letters, that's the genotype. That is telling me what type of gene I have. When you see a description like tall or short, that's going to be your phenotype. So genotype is the collection of alleles. If somebody asks you for a genotype, they want to know letters, like big, little, little. If they ask you for the phenotype, that's the appearance. So what is it that you look like? Are you tall or are you short? And again, homozygous lets you know two alleles are the same. So not that they're the same letters, they're both big or they're both small. Heterozygous means you're going to have one big one and you're going to have one small one. Now this is what we call the law of dominant and recessive. You're going to have a dominant allele, you're going to have a recessive allele. There's also a law called the law of segregation. When you segregate something, you split them in half. Because when we make egg and sperm, the recipe gets split in half. Okay? So if my recipe is a big T, little t, when I make an egg, one egg gets the big T and one egg gets the little t. Because remember, eggs have half the recipe. So the law of segregation, a gene kind of gets split in half when we're making egg and sperm. There's also what's called the law of independent assortment. Independent means there's nothing controlling it. Assortment means I'm separating them. And the law of independent assortment basically means it is random. When we make egg and sperm, not all the bigs go together, not all the littles go together. All egg and sperm are made differently.